The black maid shielded the child as a chandelier fell, and the Mafia boss understood why she was irreplaceable. The Romano family mansion stood tall, its marble floors gleaming under the opulent chandelier that hung above. Dominic Romano, the notorious Mafia boss, sat at the head of a grand dining table, his sharp eyes scanning the room, observing everything in silence. His mind was always calculating, always watching, always in control. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with tension. The dinner was tense with an unspoken undercurrent of rivalry between his associates. The laughter was forced, the clinking of glasses only adding to the oppressive atmosphere. At the far side of the room, Jessica Carter, the family's maid, moved gracefully, quietly serving the guests. Her movements were precise, every detail of her work perfect, her demeanor humble and unassuming. She had always been invisible to the powerful people around her, a mere shadow in the background. But to Dominic, Jessica was far from invisible. He had watched her for months, noticing how she carried herself with quiet strength, how she tended to Marco, his young son, with such care. Her loyalty was unquestionable, her dedication undeniable. As the evening unfolded, Dominic found himself distracted, his thoughts drifting to the woman he had always regarded as just a servant. He couldn't explain it, but something about her seemed different tonight. The air grew heavy as the guests continued to drink and talk. Suddenly, a loud crack shattered the calm. The chandelier, once a symbol of luxury, began to shake violently above them. A gasp swept through the room as the delicate crystal pieces rattled dangerously, ready to fall. In a split second, Jessica's instincts kicked in. She dashed toward Marco, the child who was seated near the table, and threw herself in front of him, shielding him with her own body as the chandelier came crashing down. The room fell silent. The crash of crystal hitting the floor was deafening, but all eyes were on Jessica and the child she had just protected. In that moment, everything changed. Dominic's heart raced as he looked at Jessica, who was still crouched protectively over Marco, her face a mask of determination and fear. He had never seen her like this, never witnessed such raw, unspoken strength. He had always seen her as a background figure, a servant to the family. But now he saw her in an entirely new light. She had saved his son. She had risked her life without hesitation. The realization hit him hard. In that instant, he understood something he had never fully grasped before. Jessica was irreplaceable, not just as a maid, but as someone who had proven her loyalty, her courage, and her heart. As the shock of the moment wore off, Dominic walked over to her. His expression softened for the first time in years. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Jessica looked up at him, her face pale but unwavering. She nodded, trying to hide the tremble in her hands. "I'm fine, sir," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear still echoing in her chest. Dominic's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, a newfound respect growing in his chest. He had always been the one to control, to dominate, but now he found himself looking at Jessica with a sense of admiration he had never felt before. She had protected his son without question, without hesitation, and in that moment, she had earned something far more valuable than his respect. She had earned his trust. The room had returned to its hushed silence, the guests now whispering among themselves, still in shock from the events that had just unfolded. But Dominic knew that the course of his life had just shifted, irrevocably, because of a single act of bravery from the woman he had always overlooked. She was more than just the maid. She was a force to be reckoned with. The chandelier lay shattered across the marble floor, its crystal pieces glittering like jagged stars beneath the dim light of the grand chandelier. The sound of the crash still echoed in the room, the silence thick and heavy. Dominic stood there, frozen, his eyes fixed on Jessica, who was slowly rising from her protective stance over Marco. His mind raced, his heart still pounding from the intensity of what had just happened. Jessica had shielded his son, without a second thought. The woman he had always seen as just a servant, a background figure in his life, had put herself in harm's way to save the one thing he held most precious. He was no stranger to danger, to the underworld he ruled, but this was something different. It was raw, it was human, and it was something he could not ignore. As the rest of the room remained in stunned silence, Dominic stepped forward. His gaze softened for the first time in what felt like forever, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Guilt. His voice, usually commanding, was quieter now as he approached Jessica. "Are you all right?" he asked, his words careful, almost tentative. Jessica slowly stood up, her knees shaky from the adrenaline. She had done what anyone in her position would have done, but now, faced with Dominic's gaze, she felt the weight of the moment. The sharp contrast between her humble position and the power that radiated from him was not lost on her. She was just a maid, after all. "I'm fine, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the racing in her chest. She brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, trying to compose herself. Dominic studied her for a moment longer, taking in the way she stood there, her posture still resolute, despite the shock of the event. His eyes, cold and calculating just moments ago, softened ever so slightly. In that brief moment, he saw something he hadn't before. He saw her as more than just a maid. He saw her as a person, not just any person, but someone who had proven her worth in the most unexpected of ways. Jessica's breath slowly returned to normal, her pulse gradually settling. She glanced at Marco, who was sitting quietly in his chair, unharmed but visibly shaken. She couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride that she had been able to protect him. She had no training, no weapons, only her instincts to guide her. And yet, it had been enough. "You didn't have to do that," Dominic said, his voice almost too soft for his usual authoritative tone. Jessica blinked, not fully understanding what he meant. "I couldn't just stand there," she replied, her words simple but truthful. "He's a child," she added, her eyes briefly meeting his. "No child should ever be in danger." Dominic's gaze lingered on her, a silent understanding passing between them. In the years he had spent building his empire, he had never once hesitated to make difficult decisions. But now, standing in front of him was a woman who had made a decision in a split second, a decision driven purely by instinct and compassion. Something inside him stirred. He had always prided himself on being in control of every situation, on being able to handle everything with a cold, calculating precision. But Jessica had acted without hesitation, without calculation, and yet it had been the right thing to do. It made him realize, in that moment, just how much he had underestimated her. Jessica, however, did not seem to notice the shift in Dominic's demeanor. She simply looked at him, waiting for whatever would come next. The weight of the situation, the responsibility of what had just happened, was still sinking in. The rest of the room remained silent, the guests no longer engaged in their previous conversations, instead watching the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and confusion. Dominic's mind was still reeling from the moment of clarity he had just experienced. He had always prided himself on being ruthless, on keeping his emotions in check, on controlling every situation. But Jessica had shattered that control with one simple act of courage. He had expected to feel anger, frustration, maybe even fear, at the way his son had been put in danger. But what he felt instead was an overwhelming sense of gratitude towards Jessica. For the first time, he questioned everything he had ever thought about power and loyalty. He took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've saved his life today," he said, his voice steady now, but there was an edge of something softer beneath it. Jessica nodded, unsure of what to say. It had been instinct, not calculation. It had been a momentary decision, and she hadn't thought twice about it. But now, standing in front of the man who controlled everything in the room, she felt the weight of his words. It wasn't lost on her that she was still the maid, the one who had always been on the outside looking in, the one who had never been seen as anything more than a servant. And yet, here she was, standing before him, having saved his son's life. A life that he valued more than anything. A life that, in his eyes, made her more than just a maid. The silence between them stretched on for a few moments longer before Dominic broke it once again. "From now on," he said, his voice lower, more intense, "you'll never be treated the same way again." Jessica's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't respond. What was he saying? What did it mean for her? For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't dared to feel before. The next few days in the Romano mansion passed in a strange, almost surreal calm. The immediate shock of the chandelier crash faded, but Dominic found his thoughts continually drifting back to Jessica. He had watched her for months, seen how she moved through the mansion with quiet grace, never demanding attention, always blending into the background. But now, everything about her had changed in his mind. She was no longer just the maid. She was someone who had saved his son's life without a second thought. Someone who had, in that instant, become irreplaceable. The more Dominic thought about it, the more he realized just how much he had underestimated her. He had always assumed that power was something that could be controlled, that loyalty could be bought. But Jessica had taught him otherwise. She had shown him what true loyalty looked like, what real courage was. It wasn't something that could be measured in money or status. It was something much deeper, something that came from within. It was a quality he hadn't seen in a long time, not even in the men who worked for him, the ones who swore their allegiance without question. But Jessica had done something that none of them had ever done. She had acted out of pure, selfless instinct. And it made him realize that he couldn't keep treating her like just another part of the household staff. She was different. On the third day after the incident, Dominic found himself walking down the grand hallway toward the dining room. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, the sound bouncing off the polished floors and high ceilings. As he approached the door, he saw Jessica standing by the window, her back to him, staring out at the garden. Her presence in the room made him pause for a moment, unsure of what to say. The air between them had changed. He had never been one to show vulnerability, never one to express his emotions openly. But something about Jessica made him feel like he needed to. He couldn't quite explain it, but he knew he needed to acknowledge what had happened. He needed to acknowledge her. "Jessica," he said, his voice calm but firm. She turned at the sound of his voice, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she responded quietly, the same respectful tone she always used. It was as if nothing had changed, as if the events of the past few days hadn't shifted the balance between them. But Dominic knew better. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't want anyone else to overhear this conversation. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice softer than usual. Jessica nodded, her posture stiff, her hands clasped in front of her. "Of course, sir," she replied, though she seemed unsure of what this conversation would entail. Dominic hesitated, searching for the right words. He had never been good at expressing gratitude, especially not in situations like this. But he knew that now he had to. "I want you to know that what you did, it didn't go unnoticed," he said finally. "You saved Marco. You saved my son." Jessica looked at him, her expression still neutral, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. "I was just doing my job, sir," she said quietly. Dominic shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "What you did goes beyond that. You acted out of instinct, out of a sense of duty that I've never seen before. I can't ignore that." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jessica didn't know how to respond. She had always kept her distance from Dominic, always maintained a certain professional distance. But this was different. She wasn't used to being acknowledged in this way, especially not by someone like him. "I don't expect anything from you, Jessica," Dominic continued, his voice steady. "But I want you to know that you're more than just a maid to me now. You're part of this family, and I'll make sure you're treated as such from now on." Jessica blinked, taken aback by his words. She had never imagined that Dominic would say something like this to her. She had always known her place in the mansion. She was just a servant, someone who was easily overlooked, easily replaced. But now, with Dominic's words, everything felt different. It was as if the ground beneath her had shifted, and, for the first time, she wondered if there was more for her here than she had ever imagined. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm just doing what anyone would do." Dominic looked at her, his gaze intense. "No," he said again, his voice firm. "Not anyone. You did something that none of us could have done. You protected Marco with your life. And for that, you have my respect." The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Jessica stood there, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to respond to the kindness that was suddenly being shown to her. She had always kept her emotions in check, had always buried her feelings beneath the surface, but now, with Dominic's words, she felt something stir inside her, something she had long buried. "I'm not asking you to change anything about how you do your work," Dominic added, his voice softening. "But I want you to know that you have a place here. A place that goes beyond just being a maid." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had never expected this. never expected that Dominic Romano, the man who ruled the household with an iron fist, would say something like this to her. She had always been invisible to him, just another face in the crowd. But now, in this moment, she felt seen. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than duty. She allowed herself to feel hope. Days turned into weeks, and Jessica found herself adjusting to the shift in the dynamics of the Romano mansion. The incident with the chandelier had changed everything, not just in the way Dominic viewed her, but in the way she viewed herself. For so long, she had defined herself by her work, by her place in the household as a maid. But now, she felt something else stirring within her, a sense of belonging, of being seen, of being valued. It wasn't something she had ever expected to feel. For the first time, she began to allow herself to hope. As the days went on, Dominic kept his word. He made sure that Jessica was treated with the respect she deserved. No longer did he refer to her in the cold, detached manner that had once defined their interactions. Instead, he spoke to her with a quiet appreciation, as if he truly understood the depth of her loyalty. He even began to rely on her more, giving her tasks beyond the typical duties of a maid. Jessica was entrusted with Marco's care on a more personal level. She helped him with his lessons, guided him through the quiet moments of his day, and spent time with him in ways that no one else could. It was in these moments, when she was alone with Marco, that Jessica felt most at peace. The child was sweet, but there was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored the quiet sorrow she had carried for years. Dominic, too, had noticed the change. His son had become more attached to Jessica, a bond that seemed to grow stronger each day. At first, Dominic had been unsure of how to feel about it. But as time passed, he realized that Jessica was not just a caregiver to Marco. She was someone who had become an essential part of the boy's life, someone who had earned his trust, his affection, and his respect. One evening, Dominic found himself walking down the hallway of the mansion, his thoughts drifting as he made his way to the study. He had become lost in the labyrinth of his mind, thinking about the ways in which his life had changed since Jessica had come into the picture. He had always thought that he could control everything, that power was the key to happiness, but now, he wasn't so sure. He stopped outside the study and glanced at the door. He knew that Jessica was in the room with Marco, helping him with his homework. It was a routine now, one that had become as familiar to him as his own breath. But today, something felt different. As he stood there, he realized that he was waiting for something that he couldn't quite explain. He had spent years building his empire, had devoted himself to a life of power and control. But in this moment, he found himself wanting something else, something softer, something more human. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, Jessica was sitting at the desk, Marco beside her, his small hand wrapped around a pencil as he worked on his math problems. Jessica glanced up at the sound of the door opening, and for a moment, their eyes met. Dominic felt something stir inside him, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was as if, in that fleeting moment, he saw her for who she truly was. Not just the maid, not just the woman who had saved his son, but someone who had become an irreplaceable part of his life. "How's he doing?" Dominic asked, his voice softer than usual. Jessica smiled, her eyes lighting up as she looked at Marco. "He's doing well," she replied. "We're almost done here. Just a few more problems left." Dominic watched the exchange between them, the way Jessica guided Marco with patience, the way she spoke to him with kindness and care. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before, and it made him realize just how much she had changed his life. For the first time, he truly understood why she was irreplaceable. Marco looked up at Dominic, his face lighting up when he saw his father. "Papa!" he exclaimed, running over to him with excitement. Dominic bent down to scoop him up, holding his son close. "How's my boy?" he asked, his voice filled with warmth. Marco grinned. "I'm doing great, Papa. Look, Jessica helped me with my math." Dominic turned his gaze to Jessica, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze, and for a moment, they shared an understanding that went beyond words. She had become more than just a maid. She had become a part of their family. "Thank you," Dominic said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. Jessica nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It's my pleasure, sir," she replied, her voice soft but steady. In that moment, Dominic realized that he had come to rely on Jessica in ways he hadn't expected. She had become an anchor in the storm of his life, someone who had brought stability and warmth into a world that had once been cold and calculating. He had never expected to feel this way about someone like her. He had always believed that his power and influence were what mattered most, but now, he understood that there was something far more valuable than that: human connection. As the evening wore on, Dominic found himself thinking more about the future, about the role Jessica would play in their lives. Moving forward, he knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were before. Too much had changed, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never take Jessica for granted again. The days that followed continued to blur together in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. Jessica had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the Romano mansion, the hum of activity in the background, the delicate balance she maintained as she went about her duties. It had been weeks since the incident with the chandelier, and though things seemed to return to a semblance of normalcy, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted. Dominic, too, seemed different. The cold, calculating persona he had once maintained around her was now softened, almost imperceptible at times, replaced with something else. A quiet respect, perhaps, or something more, something she hadn't quite figured out yet. He still carried the weight of his empire, still wielded his power with effortless ease, but when he looked at her now, there was a gentleness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't something he often showed, not even to his closest associates, but it was there. It was a side of him that Jessica hadn't known existed. One afternoon, as Jessica was finishing her duties in the garden, she noticed Dominic standing by the edge of the garden, his figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. For a moment, he simply stood there, his hands in his pockets, his gaze distant. She knew he was thinking, the way he always did, always plotting, always planning. But there was something different in the way he stood now, as if he were waiting for something, as if he were waiting for her. Jessica hesitated for a moment before walking towards him. She had never been one to engage in unnecessary conversation with him, but today felt different, as though an unspoken invitation had been extended. When she approached him, he turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. "Jessica," he said, his voice steady but with a warmth that was unusual for him. "I've been meaning to talk to you." Jessica stopped in front of him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone polite, but with an edge of uncertainty. He seemed to consider his words carefully before speaking again. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," he began, his gaze never leaving hers. "About what you did. About the choice you made." His words hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of the moment. Jessica felt a slight unease stir within her. "I did what anyone would have done," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's lips twitched, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not anyone," he said softly. "You acted when others would have hesitated." He took a step closer to her, the distance between them closing, and for the first time in a long while, Jessica felt herself flush under his gaze. She wasn't used to being seen in this way, to being acknowledged for something other than the work she did. "It was nothing," she murmured, but Dominic shook his head, his expression serious. "It wasn't nothing," he replied firmly. "You put yourself in harm's way without thinking twice. You protected my son, and for that, I will always be grateful." His words were simple, but they held a weight that Jessica wasn't prepared for. She had always been invisible to him, always the maid in the background, the one who took care of things without ever being noticed. But now, for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. She felt seen. Dominic took a breath, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "There's more to you than I've given you credit for," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I've been blind to that, but not anymore." Jessica stood there, frozen for a moment, not knowing how to respond. She had never expected this, never expected Dominic to speak to her like this, to acknowledge her beyond her duties. She had spent years serving him, working in the shadows, and now, in this moment, she found herself wondering what this meant for her. For them. "You're not just a maid, Jessica," Dominic continued, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "You've become something more to me than that, more than I ever imagined." Jessica felt a sudden rush of emotions that she couldn't quite process. She had always kept herself distant, kept her emotions in check. But now, standing in front of Dominic, she found herself struggling to contain the swell of feelings that had suddenly flooded her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice shaky. Dominic looked at her, his expression softening further. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that you have my respect. And more than that, you have my trust." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jessica stood there, her mind racing. What did this mean for her? What did this mean for Dominic? She had always been a part of the background, but now, she felt as though she were being pulled into something much deeper, something much more complicated than she had ever anticipated. Dominic's eyes searched hers, and for a moment, Jessica felt as though he could see right through her, as though he could see the very essence of who she was. "I've been thinking," Dominic said, his voice low and steady, "about how things have changed between us. And I want to make sure you understand that he gestured between them. It's not just about what happened with Marco. It's about something more." Jessica blinked, confused. "I don't understand, sir," she said softly. Dominic hesitated before speaking again, his tone thoughtful. "I'm offering you more than just a place in this house. I'm offering you a future where you're not just the maid, but someone who is valued, someone who has a place in this family." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected anything like this. She had always been content with her place in the mansion, never daring to dream of more. But now, as Dominic spoke, she realized that perhaps she had been wrong all along. Perhaps there was more for her here than she had ever imagined. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Jessica. She had always kept to herself, focusing on her duties and maintaining the distance that her position required. But now, after Dominic's words, everything felt different. He had told her that she was more than just a maid, that she had earned his respect and trust. His offer to make her a part of the family, to give her a place where she was valued, echoed in her mind constantly. It was a dream she never thought she would have, not in a mansion like this, not in a world where she had always been invisible to those around her. As she moved through the mansion, tending to her chores, she couldn't help but notice the small changes in how people interacted with her. The other staff members, who had once treated her with the indifference reserved for those of her station, now spoke to her with a newfound respect. Even the guests, the ones who used to look right through her, now acknowledged her with a polite nod or a smile. It was strange, unsettling, and yet, it felt right. One afternoon, as Jessica was cleaning the grand dining room, she found herself once again lost in her thoughts. She was dusting off the fine china, her movements automatic, when Dominic appeared in the doorway. She froze, instinctively straightening up, but he merely watched her for a moment before stepping inside. "You're doing a good job," he said, his voice steady. Jessica looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Thank you, sir," she replied quietly, not sure what else to say. There was something in his gaze that made her feel both vulnerable and valued at the same time. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room as if he were thinking about something far beyond the walls of the mansion. "I've been thinking more about what I said the other day," Dominic began, his voice thoughtful. Jessica blinked, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "I meant what I said," he continued. "You've proven yourself to be more than just someone who serves this family. You've shown a level of loyalty and courage that is rare. And I don't want to forget that." She stood there, stunned. She had never expected this kind of acknowledgement from Dominic. The man who had always been so detached, so focused on his empire, was now standing in front of her, speaking to her as if she were someone who truly mattered. "I understand your place here," Dominic said, his tone softer now. "And I respect it. But I want to give you something more. Something that goes beyond just your duties as a maid." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. What was he offering? What could he possibly mean? "I want to make sure you have a future here," he continued, his eyes meeting hers. "A future where you are not just working for us, but are part of this family. You've earned it." Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always dreamed of a life where she was seen, where she was more than just an invisible servant. But she never thought it could happen. And now, standing here with Dominic, she realized that this might be her chance. She had always kept her distance, never allowed herself to hope for something more, but now, she couldn't ignore the possibility. "What are you saying, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic paused, his gaze intense. I'm saying that you have a place here, Jessica. A real place. Not just as a maid, but as someone who has earned her place in this family. For a moment, everything went silent. Jessica stood there, her thoughts swirling. She had never expected this. She had never allowed herself to dream of something like this. But now, with Dominic's words, she saw a future she had never imagined. "You're offering me a future?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dominic nodded, his expression serious. "Yes," he said firmly. "But it's up to you. You can continue on as you have been, or you can take a chance. A chance to be more than just a servant. A chance to be a part of this family, a part of something bigger." Jessica's mind raced as she thought about the life she had known, the quiet, lonely existence she had led for so many years. And then she thought about the future Dominic was offering her. The future where she was valued, where she had a place in the world beyond the confines of the mansion's walls. The future where she wasn't invisible anymore. "What if I'm not ready?" she asked softly. "What if I don't know how to be more than what I've always been?" Dominic stepped closer, his gaze softening. "You don't have to know everything right now," he said gently. "It's not about being perfect. It's about knowing that you deserve more. And I'm offering you that chance. To see what it's like to live in a world where you're seen, where you're respected, and where you matter." Jessica felt something shift inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience before, the feeling of being truly seen, of being valued for who she was, not just for what she did. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic gave her a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to say anything, Jessica. Just think about it. I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. Not if you don't want to." Jessica stood there, her heart racing, her thoughts a whirlwind. She had always kept her distance, never allowing herself to imagine a future like this. But now, as she looked at Dominic, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to live a life she had never dreamed possible. A life where she was more than just the maid, more than just someone who worked in the background. A life where she mattered. The mansion had been quieter than usual for the past few days, the usual hum of activity replaced with an unfamiliar stillness that lingered in the air. Jessica moved through the halls, her steps lighter than before, the weight of her duties feeling different now. The offer that Dominic had made still echoed in her mind, and with each passing day, she found herself thinking about it more. She had spent so many years being invisible, always in the background, never truly seen for who she was. But now, she was faced with a choice she had never imagined. A choice that went beyond anything she had ever dreamed of. It wasn't just about being a part of this family. It was about being more than what she had been. It was about being seen, respected, and, perhaps for the first time, truly valued. That thought, the idea that she mattered, made her heart race and her mind swirl with questions. What would her life look like if she accepted Dominic's offer? What would it mean for her, for Marco, for the future of the Romano family? She didn't have all the answers, and she certainly didn't know what the right choice was. But she did know one thing. Things had changed. She had changed. As Jessica pondered these thoughts, she found herself standing by the window in the library, staring out at the garden. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. It was a peaceful sight, one that had always brought her a sense of calm. But today, it felt different. Today, she couldn't escape the weight of her thoughts. "Jessica," a voice called out from behind her, pulling her from her reverie. She turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his presence commanding but softer than she was used to. "I was hoping we could talk," he said, his tone steady but filled with something unspoken. Jessica nodded, her heart skipping a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, for the chance to speak with him again, to find clarity in the uncertainty that had settled between them. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Dominic stepped into the room, his gaze focused on her as he moved closer. For a moment, they simply stood there, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Jessica could feel her pulse quicken, the air charged with an electricity that she couldn't quite explain. "I've been thinking about everything," Dominic said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant. "About the offer I made, and about what it means for you." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She had been hoping for this conversation, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to say. "I don't want to pressure you into making a decision," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will respect it. Jessica swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had never imagined this moment. She had never imagined that someone like Dominic would offer her a future, a chance to be something more than just a maid. I've never had a choice like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what to do. Dominic stepped closer, his expression softening. You don't have to have all the answers right now, Jessica, he said gently. This isn't about rushing. It's about giving you the opportunity to choose what's best for you. You've done so much for this family, for Marco. I want to make sure you have the chance to live the life you deserve. Jessica's heart swelled with emotion. The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her, it was all so overwhelming. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, unimportant, and now, in this moment, she felt as though she were finally being seen for who she was. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted, her voice shaky. I've always just done my job, always kept to myself. Dominic's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to have it all figured out, he said with a small, reassuring smile. But I want you to know that you don't have to be invisible anymore. You have a place here. You matter. The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she was speechless. Could it really be that simple? Could she truly have a place, a future, where she was valued for more than just her work? For more than just being the maid? I've always been content with my life here, she said softly, her mind still reeling. I've always just done my job and kept my distance. I never thought there was anything else for me. Dominic's expression grew serious. You don't have to settle for that, he said firmly. You've earned more than that. You've shown me what true loyalty, what true courage, really looks like. And I want you to know that you have the chance to be something more. Not just for us, but for yourself. Jessica felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. She had never allowed herself to dream of something more, had never allowed herself to think that she deserved more. But now, with Dominic's words, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she did. I don't know what the future holds, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But I want to try. I want to see what it's like to be something more. Dominic smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made Jessica's heart flutter. That's all I'm asking, he said softly. Take a chance, Jessica. You've earned it. For the first time, Jessica felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know exactly where this new path would lead, but for the first time in her life, she felt hope. She felt like she had the chance to be something more. And that thought, more than anything, made her heart soar. The days that followed were filled with a sense of new beginnings for Jessica. Every morning, as she walked through the grand halls of the Romano mansion, she felt a subtle shift in the air. It was as if the weight that had once defined her position in this house had lifted, replaced by a new understanding of her worth. For so long, she had been nothing more than a shadow, an invisible presence in the background. But now, everything was different. Dominic had made it clear that she mattered, that she was no longer just the maid, but a person who had earned a place in this family. And that thought, while exhilarating, was also a little daunting. What did it mean to be seen? To be valued? She spent the next few days in quiet reflection, trying to process the enormity of what Dominic had offered her. She had always kept her distance, had always been the one to fade into the background, never asking for more. But now, with every passing day, she felt more and more like she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. A chapter where she wasn't invisible anymore. It wasn't just the way the other staff treated her, although that had changed as well. It wasn't just the respect that now came with every interaction. It was the way she felt about herself. She felt as if she had a future, as if there was more for her than just the endless cycle of cleaning and serving. She had never allowed herself to imagine a life outside of those walls. But now, she couldn't help but dream. One afternoon, as Jessica was tending to the garden, she saw Dominic walking toward her. He had become a familiar presence in her life, someone who had once seemed so distant, so unreachable, but now felt much closer. She had seen him more frequently over the past few days, and with each interaction, she felt a connection growing between them. It wasn't romantic, not in the way she had once imagined, but there was something undeniably powerful about the bond that was forming. He had given her more than just his respect. He had given her a sense of belonging. As he approached, she straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. Jessica, he said, his voice warm. I hope I'm not interrupting. She smiled softly, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that always seemed to accompany his presence. No, sir, she replied, her voice steady. I was just finishing up here. Dominic nodded, his eyes scanning the garden with appreciation. It looks beautiful, he said. I've been meaning to ask you something. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he was about to say, but she was eager to listen. Of course, sir, she said, her tone respectful but curious. Dominic paused for a moment, as if carefully considering his words. I've been thinking, he began, his gaze shifting to meet hers, about what you said the other day. About the future. And I want to know what you want. What kind of life do you want, Jessica? Jessica blinked in surprise. She had never been asked that question before. In all the years she had worked in the mansion, no one had ever asked her what she wanted. She had always been the one to take care of others, to anticipate their needs, to fade into the background. But now, standing before Dominic, she realized that for the first time, she had a chance to voice her own desires. I don't know, she said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. I've never really thought about it. I've always just done what was needed, what was expected of me. Dominic stepped closer, his expression softening. You don't have to keep doing that, Jessica. You don't have to just take what's given to you. I want you to have the chance to choose, to decide what you want from life. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Jessica wasn't used to. The idea of having a choice, of having control over her own life, felt both overwhelming and liberating. For so long, she had lived in the shadows, never allowing herself to think about a future that was different from her present. But now, with Dominic's words, she realized that the future was hers to shape. What do you want for yourself, Jessica? Dominic asked again, his voice gentle but insistent. Jessica took a deep breath, her thoughts racing. She thought about all the years she had spent in the mansion, about all the things she had sacrificed, the dreams she had buried deep inside herself. And then, for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she was more than just a servant. She began, her voice trembling slightly. I want a life where I can be more than this. Where I don't have to be invisible, where I can do something that matters. I want to be able to choose my path, to not feel like I'm always in the background. Dominic's gaze softened, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. And you can, he said firmly. You have the power to choose, Jessica. You've always had the power. I just want to make sure you know that. His words washed over her like a wave, and for the first time in her life, Jessica felt a sense of hope. She had spent so long thinking that her worth was tied to her work, to what she could provide for others. But now, she realized that her worth was not defined by what she did. It was defined by who she was. And Dominic had seen that. He had seen her. And for that, she would be forever grateful. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. You don't have to thank me, he said quietly. Just know that you deserve more. And I'll be here, whatever you decide. Jessica nodded, a new sense of resolve settling over her. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. The future was hers to create. And for the first time, she felt ready to take that step forward, whatever it might be. The following days passed by with a quiet sense of anticipation hanging in the air. For Jessica, each moment felt like a step towards something new, something unfamiliar, but full of possibility. The offer Dominic had made was still fresh in her mind, and though she hadn't fully made up her mind, she felt a growing sense of resolve. She had spent so many years living in the shadows, never daring to dream of a life beyond the confines of the Romano mansion. But now, with Dominic's words echoing in her thoughts, she realized she had more power than she had ever imagined. As she moved through the mansion, tending to her duties, she couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in how she was treated. No longer did she feel like an outsider, someone who simply blended into the background. The staff, once distant and cold, now treated her with a newfound respect. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but the shift had come gradually, almost imperceptibly. She found herself interacting with the other staff members in a way she had never done before, engaging in small conversations, exchanging pleasantries. It was a strange feeling, but one that made her feel more connected, more a part of the world around her. And it wasn't just the staff who had begun to treat her differently. Marco, too, had started to see her in a new light. The The bond between them had deepened over the past few weeks. He had become more attached to her, seeking her out for comfort, for guidance. It was something she hadn't expected, but it warmed her heart. Every time he smiled up at her, his small hand reaching for hers, she felt a sense of pride swell within her. She was no longer just the maid. She was someone who had earned a place in his life, someone who had become a source of comfort and stability. One evening, as she was helping Marco with his lessons in the library, Dominic appeared at the door. He stood there for a moment, watching them in silence, before stepping inside. Marco looked up with a bright smile, his excitement palpable. "Papa!" he exclaimed, rushing over to Dominic. Dominic bent down to lift his son into his arms, his face softening as he embraced him. "How's my boy?" he asked, his voice filled with warmth. Marco grinned, holding up his completed homework. "I'm doing great, Papa. Look, Jessica helped me finish all my work." Dominic's gaze shifted to Jessica, who was standing nearby, watching the exchange with a soft smile. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jessica felt a slight flutter in her chest. She had always admired Dominic from afar, never expecting that one day she would be seen as someone important in his life. But now, standing in this moment, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of gratitude. "You've been doing well, haven't you, Marco?" Dominic said, his tone gentle as he set his son down. Marco nodded eagerly, his eyes sparkling with pride. "Jessica's the best," he declared, looking up at her with an expression of pure adoration. Dominic's lips curled into a faint smile as he looked from his son to Jessica. "I can see that," he said quietly. "You've been a big help to him, Jessica. I appreciate everything you've done." Jessica felt a warmth spread through her at his words. And though she tried to keep her composure, she couldn't help the sense of pride that bubbled up inside her. For so long, she had been overlooked, dismissed as nothing more than a servant. But now, in this moment, she felt seen. She had earned his respect, not through words or grand gestures, but through quiet, steadfast loyalty. She had earned her place. Dominic gave Marco one last hug before standing up and turning his attention back to Jessica. "I wanted to speak with you," he said, his tone serious but not unkind. "About what we discussed before." Jessica's heart skipped a beat, her thoughts racing. She had known this conversation was coming, but the reality of it still made her feel uneasy. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice steady, though a bit of nervousness crept into her words. Dominic stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've thought a lot about the future, about what I want for this family, and what I want for you." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "I want to make sure you have the chance to live a life that's truly yours. A life where you don't have to feel like you're in the background anymore." Jessica swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She hadn't realized how much she had longed for those words, how much she had craved a life where she didn't have to hide, where she could step into the light and be seen for who she was. "I know I've offered you a lot, Jessica," Dominic continued, "but I want you to know that this isn't just about what I want for you. It's about what you want for yourself." His words felt like a revelation, a truth she hadn't allowed herself to see before. She had always been focused on serving others, on doing her job without question, but now, Dominic was offering her something else, something more. "What do you want, Jessica?" he asked, his voice soft, but filled with an intensity that took her by surprise. Jessica looked up at him, her mind spinning. What did she want? For so long, she had never dared to ask herself that question. She had always lived for others, always been the one who gave, who served, who put everyone else's needs first. But now, as she stood before Dominic, she realized that she could no longer live that way. She had to live for herself. She began, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to have a future where I'm not invisible. I want a life where I can stand on my own, where I can be proud of who I am, not just what I do." Dominic's gaze softened, his expression filled with understanding. "And you can," he said firmly. "You have every right to want that. You deserve more, Jessica. You've always deserved more." His words settled over her like a warm embrace, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe them. She had spent so long hiding, so long feeling unworthy, but now, standing here with Dominic, she realized that she had the power to change her life. She had the power to shape her own future. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic nodded, his eyes gentle. "You don't have to thank me. You've earned everything that's coming to you, Jessica. Just know that I'm here to support you, no matter what. Jessica's heart swelled with gratitude as she looked at him. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to take that first step toward it. And whatever happened, she knew she wouldn't have to walk alone. The days that followed were filled with quiet contemplation for Jessica. She spent most of her time in the mansion, tending to her duties, but now there was a new sense of purpose in her steps. The offer that Dominic had made to her lingered in her thoughts constantly. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what a future could look like beyond the walls of this mansion. What would it be like to live a life where she was no longer invisible, no longer just the maid? What if she could truly have a place here, in this family, and not just in the background? It was a terrifying thought, but also thrilling. She had always kept herself at a distance, afraid to hope, afraid to dream. But Dominic had given her that opportunity, and with every passing day, she found herself leaning closer to the possibility of something more. One evening, as she finished up her tasks in the kitchen, she found herself standing at the window, gazing out at the garden. The night was calm, the stars visible in the clear sky above. It was a peaceful moment, but the quiet was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his presence as commanding as ever, but there was something different in his eyes, something softer, something more familiar. "Jessica," he said, his voice steady but with a warmth she wasn't used to hearing. She straightened up, unsure of what to expect, but there was no tension between them, no formality. This felt different. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Dominic stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he began. "About wanting more, about not wanting to be invisible anymore." Jessica's heart skipped a beat at his words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear him acknowledge it, to hear him say what she had been too afraid to say out loud. "I meant what I said," Dominic continued, his gaze softening. "You deserve more than just being in the background. You deserve to have a life that's yours, to be seen, to be valued for who you are, not just for what you do." Jessica swallowed, the weight of his words sinking in. It felt like the world was shifting beneath her feet, as if everything that had defined her life up until now was beginning to unravel, replaced by the possibility of something better, something different. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's a lot to think about." Dominic's expression didn't change, but there was an understanding in his eyes, a quiet reassurance that made Jessica feel like she wasn't alone in her uncertainty. "You don't have to be ready right now," he said gently. "I'm not asking you to make a decision today, but I want you to know that whatever path you choose, I'll be here. You have a place here, Jessica, and you always will." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. Jessica felt her chest tighten with emotion, her heart racing with the realization that everything was changing. She had always been a part of this household, but now, she was beginning to understand that she could be more than just a servant. She could be something else, something more. "I don't know how to explain it," Jessica said, her voice trembling slightly. "But for the first time, I feel like there's more for me. Like I'm not just here to clean and serve. I'm here for something else. Something bigger." Dominic nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "That's exactly what I mean," he said. "You've always had potential, Jessica. More than you even realize. I want to make sure you have the chance to live up to that potential. To live a life where you're not just seen for your work, but for who you truly are." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. She had never allowed herself to think of herself as someone with potential, someone who could have a future beyond the mansion. But now, with Dominic's words, she realized that maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe there was more for her than she had ever allowed herself to believe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You've earned everything that's coming to you, Jessica, and I want to help you get there." Jessica nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had always been afraid to ask for more, to want more, but now, she understood that it wasn't wrong to have dreams, to have hopes for the future. And Dominic, in his own way, had shown her that it was okay to pursue those dreams. I'll take my time to think about it, she said quietly, her voice steady. But I'm grateful for the opportunity, for the chance to be more. Dominic's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a look of pride in his gaze. Take all the time you need, he said. But just know that I'm here, and you're not alone in this. Jessica's heart felt lighter than it had in years. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she had a chance to shape her own path. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, and for that, she was deeply grateful. The days following their conversation seemed to pass in a haze for Jessica. She moved through the mansion as though in a dream, her steps lighter, her thoughts heavier. The future that Dominic had offered her was still a weight on her shoulders, but now, it didn't feel so heavy. The uncertainty that had once held her in place was slowly lifting, replaced by the quiet realization that she was no longer just existing. She was finally living. Dominic had given her the opportunity to imagine a life outside of the confines of the mansion, a life where she could have her own place, her own purpose. And though she hadn't made a final decision, she felt the pull towards something greater. One evening, as she finished her evening duties and prepared to retire to her small room in the staff wing, she found herself drawn to the garden again. The night air was cool, the stars shining brightly above her, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, breathing in the stillness. It was here, in this quiet space, that she often found peace. It was here that she could think clearly, where the weight of her responsibilities didn't feel so heavy. But tonight, her thoughts were not on her duties or the offer Dominic had made. They were on Marco. Over the past few weeks, she had spent more time with him, helping him with his lessons, reading stories to him before bed, and watching as he grew more comfortable in her presence. It was a bond she had never expected to form, but it was one she now treasured. Marco had become like a son to her, and she had become like a mother to him. It was an unexpected shift, but it felt natural, like it was meant to be. And yet, there was still a part of her that wondered what her future would hold. Would she remain here, in the mansion, serving the Romano family? Or would she take the leap and step into a new life, one where she could be more than just the maid? She didn't know the answer, but she knew that the decision was hers to make. As she stood in the garden, lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Dominic approaching, his figure silhouetted against the soft glow of the lanterns lining the garden path. He had a quiet presence about him, one that always seemed to command attention without needing to raise his voice. "Jessica," he said, his voice calm, yet filled with something unspoken. She straightened up, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her heart racing. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Dominic stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful, "about what you said the other day, about wanting more. And I want you to know that I stand by what I said. Whatever you decide, whatever path you choose, I will support you." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again, not so soon. But hearing him say it once more brought a rush of emotions she wasn't prepared for. "You've given me more than I ever imagined," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I never thought there was more for me. I've always just done what I was told, served the family, kept my head down." Dominic's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Jessica saw something in his gaze that made her feel as though she weren't just a maid. She was someone who mattered. "You're more than that, Jessica," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "You've always been more, and I want to make sure you understand that. You deserve more than to just be a background figure in this house. You deserve a life where you're valued, not just for what you can do, but for who you are." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of his words hitting her harder than she expected. For so long, she had been nothing more than a shadow in the mansion, moving quietly through the halls, serving the family without ever being truly seen. But now, with Dominic's words, she began to understand that she had always been seen. She just hadn't allowed herself to believe it. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never had the chance to think about what I want. I've always just been here." Dominic stepped closer, his presence overwhelming but not intimidating. "You don't have to know everything right now, Jessica," he said softly. "This isn't about being ready. It's about giving you the freedom to choose. To know that you have options, that you don't have to settle for a life that doesn't make you happy. His words were a balm to the uncertainty that had been building inside her for so long. She had always felt trapped by her circumstances, by the life she had known. But now, for the first time, she saw that there was a way out. She could have the life she wanted. It was up to her to take the first step. "What if I'm afraid?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if I don't know where to start?" Dominic gave her a small, reassuring smile. "That's okay," he said. "Fear is normal, but it doesn't have to control you. I'll be here to help guide you, to support you, every step of the way. Whatever you choose, whatever path you take, you won't have to walk it alone." Jessica's heart swelled with gratitude, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of a future outside the confines of the mansion. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she was ready to take that first step into the unknown. With Dominic's support, she felt as though anything was possible. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." Dominic nodded, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Jessica," he said. "You've always had the strength within you. I just want to make sure you see it too." In that moment, standing in the garden with Dominic, Jessica realized that her future was not defined by her past. She had the power to shape her own destiny. And no matter where that path led, she knew she would be okay. The days turned into weeks, and Jessica's life continued to shift in ways she had never anticipated. With each passing day, the weight of uncertainty that had once settled so heavily on her shoulders seemed to lift. She found herself navigating through the mansion with a new sense of purpose, her steps lighter, her thoughts clearer. The decision she had been grappling with, what path to take, whether to remain in the shadows or embrace the opportunity Dominic had offered her, began to feel less daunting. In fact, she started to embrace the idea of taking that first step towards something different, something of her own making. It wasn't just about the mansion anymore, about the family she served. It was about her own future, her own dreams. She had always been so focused on others, on making sure their needs were met, that she had never truly allowed herself to think about what she wanted. But now, with Dominic's support, she had started to consider the possibilities. She could choose her path. One evening, as Jessica finished her duties in the garden, she felt the soft breeze of the evening air on her face. The garden had always been her refuge, the one place where she could pause and breathe, away from the bustle of her responsibilities. It was here, in this peaceful corner of the mansion, that she found the space to reflect. As she walked along the winding path, lost in thought, she heard footsteps approaching behind her. She turned to see Dominic walking toward her, his pace slow but purposeful. His presence had become a constant in her life, and with it, a sense of something more, something she wasn't entirely sure how to define. He had given her more than just his respect. He had given her a glimpse of a life she hadn't dared to imagine. He had opened the door to a future where she wasn't invisible anymore. "Jessica," Dominic said, his voice calm but filled with something deeper. "I've been thinking about everything we've talked about." Jessica stopped, turning to face him. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Dominic stopped a few feet away, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You've made a decision, haven't you?" he asked, his tone not so much questioning as it was understanding. Jessica hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The decision had not come easily. She had spent countless hours contemplating the choice ahead of her, weighing the risks, the possibilities. But now, standing in front of Dominic, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced before. "I think I have," she said finally, her voice quieter now, the weight of her words settling on her shoulders. Dominic gave her a small, knowing smile. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his gaze searching her face. Jessica took a deep breath, her chest tight with the mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to take that step. To live a life where I'm not just a servant, where I can be more than what I've been. I want to see what's out there, what I can become." Dominic's eyes softened, and for a moment, she saw something in his gaze, pride, maybe, or even relief. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "It's not an easy thing, stepping into the unknown, but you've always had the strength to do it. And you don't have to do it alone. Whatever you choose, I'll be here." The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment, she felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, relief, and a sense of determination. She had never allowed herself to hope for more, to believe that she could have more, but now, with Dominic's words, she realized that she had the power to create the life she wanted. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Dominic nodded, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me, Jessica," he said gently. "You've always had the potential to do this. I'm just giving you the chance to see it." Jessica smiled, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to embrace it. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she first entered the mansion. She wasn't the same woman who had kept her head down and done her work without question. She had changed, and with that change came the freedom to choose her own path. As she stood there, facing Dominic, Jessica felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges along the way. But for the first time, she felt like she was walking towards something that was hers to shape. And that thought, more than anything, made her heart soar. "I'll make sure you're not alone," Dominic said, his voice reassuring. "Whatever happens next, you'll have my support." Jessica nodded, her smile widening. She knew she had made the right decision. It wasn't just about leaving behind her role as a servant. It was about stepping into her own future, a future where she could be more than what she had ever imagined. And no matter where that future took her, she knew she was ready to face it with the strength and courage that had always been inside her. The weeks that followed were filled with both excitement and uncertainty for Jessica. She had made her decision, and though it had taken her some time to come to terms with it, she was finally moving forward with a sense of purpose. The mansion, once a place where she felt invisible, now seemed different, almost like a place she could truly belong. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone with her own future, her own choices. She had never imagined that one day she would feel this way, that she would have the power to change the course of her life. But Dominic had made it clear that the decision was hers, that she wasn't bound by the past, and that her future was not limited to the role she had always known. The days felt like a blur as she started to shift her focus. She spent time thinking about what she truly wanted for herself. It was strange to think that she could have choices, that she could pursue something beyond the confines of the mansion. But with every passing day, the idea of stepping into a life she had once thought was out of reach became more appealing. One afternoon, as she was walking through the garden, her mind wandered back to her conversation with Dominic. His words echoed in her mind. "You deserve more than just being in the background. You deserve a life where you're valued for who you are, not just for what you do." She could still feel the warmth of his voice, the sincerity that had filled his words. It was the first time someone had ever spoken to her like that, as though she were worthy of something more. Jessica stopped for a moment to take in the beauty of the garden, the vibrant colors of the flowers in full bloom, the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. It was a place of calm, a place where she had spent countless hours, but now it felt different. It felt like a space where she could finally breathe, where she could imagine a future outside of her duties. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone in this. Dominic had offered her his support, his trust, and now it was up to her to take that first step. As if on cue, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Dominic approaching, his presence commanding yet gentle. "Jessica," he said, his voice calm and steady. She turned to face him, her heart racing. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside her. Dominic stopped a few feet away, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "I've been thinking," he began, "about everything you've said and everything that's come to pass. I know this is a big change for you, and I want you to know that I'm here, whatever you decide." Jessica swallowed hard. She had already made her decision, but hearing him say those words again gave her a sense of peace she hadn't realized she needed. "I've thought about it a lot," she said quietly, "and I'm ready to step into something new, something more. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I know I can't keep living the way I have." Dominic nodded, his expression softening. "I'm proud of you, Jessica," he said sincerely. "It takes a lot of courage to step into the unknown, to embrace the possibility of something different. And I'll be here every step of the way." Jessica felt a rush of gratitude. She had always felt like an outsider in the mansion, like she was nothing more than a cog in a machine that would keep turning without her. But now, with Dominic's words, she realized that she had a place here, that she was more than just a servant. She was a person with her own worth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic smiled, the expression genuine. "You don't need to thank me. This is your journey, Jessica. I'm just here to make sure you know you're not alone in it." With that, the conversation seemed to settle into a comfortable silence, the air between them full of understanding. Jessica looked at him, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know where this new path would lead, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk down it. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of others, never daring to hope for anything more. But now, with Dominic's encouragement, she knew that she had the power to shape her own future. And as she looked out at the garden, the promise of that future felt closer than ever. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her small room, Jessica allowed herself a moment to reflect. The mansion, the family, her work, it all seemed so distant now, as if she were looking at it from the outside in. It had been a life she knew well, a life she had accepted without question, but now, it felt like a chapter closing. She was ready for a new one. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know where her future would take her, but one thing was certain, she was no longer invisible. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift she could give herself. She had a future now, a future that was hers to create.